The church repeatedly weaponizes this chapter. It misappropriates this chapter. That's good. Misappropriates.
Tell us name where you're calling from.
Yeah, I'd like to find out Matthew, I forget the Jesus, oh not Matthew, Mark, where Jesus is on the cross and they attribute to him saying, you know, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I'd like to know what the purpose of that being in there. I know it's a misquote from Psalm 22:1. I'm wondering what the rabbi is able to do with that passage, why it's misquoted. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Hang on now, Gene, for your answer. Rabbi, that's a good one.
Well, as it turns out, that what's called the cry of dereliction appears both in Mark and in Matthew. It appears both in Mark 15:34 and Matthew 27, verse 46. Matthew simply copied Mark. Matthew essentially quotes almost all of the book of Mark. What the gospel writers are doing is they're simply copying, pasting from the book of Psalms and taking passages that are not prophecies and then placing them in the mouth of Jesus. They're using Sefer Tehillim, the book of Psalms, as a sort of as a palette for which a painter creates a painting. We're told in both Matthew and Mark, in the third hour in the afternoon, which means at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cries out with a loud voice. This is him on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And that comes from Psalm 22. It's a little tricky. It's verse 1 in a Christian Bible, but it's verse 2 in a Hebrew Bible. And there's the reason why this difference appears is not nefarious. It's just that the Christian Bibles copy the format of the Septuagint, so they don't assign the first opening passage to a verse number. So that's all it is, okay? You know, what's happening here is King David is crying out. King David, as we have seen in the chapters that introduce this passage, is in a lot of trouble. I mean, imagine the pain that he experienced. I mean, it would be hard to imagine what you would do, God forbid, if the people who you love betrayed you. Has that ever happened to you? Imagine your own son wanted to kill you. Imagine if your father-in-law wanted to destroy you. Imagine if the people closest to you wanted to bring you down. And I would imagine that the pain you've experienced in your life has more likely to come from people who are very close to you rather than strangers. It didn't come from a cashier at Walmart, but rather the people that are close to you. And King David is crying out. This is all going to lead to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. That means all these chapters that start out many, many passages earlier, going back to Psalm 16, 17, all very famous. King David is crying out. None of this, incidentally, makes any sense when applying it to Jesus. And the authors of the Gospels knew this. Particularly Mark understood this. So when he quotes, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" he stops there. If you keep reading the text, Rachek mishuasi divrei shagosi. Your salvation is distant from me, the words of my groaning. Literally, by the way, the same root for salvation is in there. What does that mean? Like, first of all, why would Jesus be crying out, why hast thou forsaken me? It makes no sense in itself. Why? Because we are told in the Gospels, in the same Gospels, whether it's Mark chapter 8 or Matthew chapter 16, that Jesus knew all this already. So why is he asking the question? Moreover, why does he feel that God forsook him? We are told in the Gospels that Jesus said, this is exactly what's supposed to happen to me. So why is he crying? Why did the Gospel stop short when he says, Rachek mishuasi, your salvation is far from me? What are you talking about, your salvation is far from me? I am salvation. If you're Jesus, and what does it mean, far from me? Jesus already said he's going to have to suffer many things, but he's going to resurrect on the third day. It literally says that. What is he talking about? Moreover, this cry of dereliction found in Matthew and Mark doesn't fit into the doctrine of the Trinity in any way. It's very, very strange. In Christian theology, Jesus was God, and he wasn't 50% God and 50% man, so therefore the human part of him is crying out. Christians insist, Trinitarians claim that Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. Who was he talking to? Was he crying out to himself? That means, was this a genuine question? See, like nothing works. The whole thing, it's like a systems theory, like the whole equation just collapses once you insert Christian theology, the doctrine of the hypostatic union. Was this a genuine question Jesus is asking on the cross? Why have you forsaken me? Is there information that God has, the Father has, that the Son doesn't have? Do they not possess the same mind? Is God dying on the cross and asking God, why is this happening to me? Just forget about the fact that we are told that Jesus has been running around telling his disciples, this is what's going to happen to me, and that we find in all the Gospels. Why is God unaware of what's happening? Why is God asking God, why am I dying? In fact, we find in the night before, he's pleading with God, take this cup not from my will, but your will. Like, why is God pleading with God to not go ahead with this whole thing? And the Christians frequently say, well, that's the human side of Jesus. Really? The human side of Jesus? Does that make him less divine? The human side of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, Christian claims that hypostatic essence of the Son doesn't rob him or shouldn't rob him of him being one with the Father. So who is he talking to? Why is he crying? Why doesn't he know? Is this a genuine question? You see, what happens is when you just keep building the story or building the theology, that's what's really going on here. Mark contains an adoptionist theology that Jesus was a regular person, not born of a virgin, not a logos, none of that stuff. It's the most primitive of all the Gospels. And therefore, in Mark's view, there's no Trinity. Jesus was a man who was adopted as God's son at his baptism. That's how the book of Mark opens. So therefore, it works in the book of Mark in that Jesus doesn't know. It kind of works. It still is problematic because in Mark chapter 8, he's saying this is what's going to happen. So even in Mark's Jesus, there are so many problems. But the big problem is, why is God asking himself, why have you abandoned me? Elohi, Elohi, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? What do you mean, forsaken me? God forsook God? Why don't you know this? You're God. Everything collapses when you make this stuff up. There are, it should be said, different versions of Jesus' passion narrative. In fact, there are 7 different things that Jesus says on the cross. But in Mark's iteration, Jesus is clueless. It's very, very different than Luke, and it's extremely different than John. In Luke, we don't have Jesus not understanding what's happening. In Luke, we have a much more informed Jesus, a Jesus who's much more in control in his conversations with God before his crucifixion. He knows exactly what's happening on his way to be crucified. As he sees women weeping, he says to them, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves. Very, very much in control. It's a very different kind of Jesus going to his death. And then Jesus says in Luke's version, forgive them, Father, for they don't even know what they're doing. Jesus is having a highly intelligent conversation with the other 2 people who are crucified with him, because in Luke's iteration, one of those people who are being crucified with him actually believes in Jesus, and Jesus says to him that you will be with me in paradise today. So we have a very different idea or picture of Jesus' crucifixion in Luke, and very different in the book of John. Jesus is just completely in control, but Mark and Matthew, Jesus is really just clueless. He has no idea why this is happening to him. He just doesn't understand, which is very different. But the key point that I want to drive home is that in Psalm 22, the church repeatedly weaponizes this chapter. It misappropriates this chapter. That's good. Misappropriates it. Because these passages in Psalm 22 are not prophecies about the future. Psalm 22 is King David speaking. The author is speaking in the first person. He's not saying in the future someone else will say this. King David is crying out. In fact, he's wondering aloud, if you continue reading Psalm 22, like, why aren't you there? Why is it quiet? Why don't you answer me? He doesn't understand it. I cried at night. You're not there. And King David says, you listen to my ancestors, but to me, you're silent. Why? Well, this doesn't make any sense if you apply this to Jesus. It makes all the sense in the world if you apply this to David in this very bitter moment. I mean, have you ever felt that God is silent in your life? Have you ever cried out to God and wondered where he is in your life? Well, that's what King David is expressing. And then Psalm 23, which you're all familiar with, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's where it all culminates. That's where it all resolves. And that is, even though I'm walking in the shadow of death, I know that you're with me. Your staff, your rod, they comfort me. That's the whole point. So the resolution is in Psalm 23. So Psalm 22 is the palette from which the authors of the Christian Bible use. It's not only Matthew and Mark doesn't do this. Luke is going to do this. John's going to do this in different passages. My mouth is dry, taken. My garments are divided, taken Psalm 22. Moreover, and more crazy, in the 2nd century, church doctors, and I use that word carefully, doctors, they will doctor Psalm 22 to squeeze out another passage that doesn't even exist. Psalm 22, verse 16 in the Christian Bible, 17 in the Hebrew Bible, reads, "For dogs have encompassed me, a company of evildoers have surrounded me. Like a lion, they're at my hands and my feet." But the Christian Bible changes to, "They pierced my hands and my feet." Literally alters the text. Now, that is not in the Christian Bible because the authors of the New Testament did not think this one up. They weren't imaginative to come up with that one. So that delusional misquote is not New Testament. That's already 2nd century. So that's what's going on here. You see how convoluted this gets? That's why if you're telling the truth, you don't have to keep track of what you're saying. Why? Because everything will fall into place. But the moment you start playing with the text, then nothing makes sense. And that's what we encounter in Psalm 22 in this opening passage. King David is speaking of himself in the first person, and the church simply takes that and places that in the mouth of a dying Jesus. Mark will do that. Matthew will do that, copying Mark. And this is just the last point. The reason why I always say that Luke is later than Matthew by at least 5 years, some scholars believe Luke is much, much later than Matthew, is for this reason, because it's more highly developed in many, many ways, including this one. The portrait of Jesus is a much more embellished portrait of Jesus than we find in the book of Mark. Thank you so much for your question.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא להתנסה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא עובר